The fires did not begin at the walls. They began in the storehouses. Long before an enemy reached the gates of Hattusa, men were already counting what remained. Jars of grain. Bundles of dried fruit. Animals that could still be slaughtered. Tablets arrived from distant provinces with the same message written in different words: the harvest had failed, the roads were unsafe, the ships were late, and the king's commands were becoming harder to obey. From the high citadel, the capital still looked unconquerable. Stone walls crossed the hills in long, pale lines. Towers watched the valleys. Lion-shaped guardians stood at the gates. Temples filled the upper city. Royal archives held treaties, prayers, court judgments, military reports, and letters from kings who called one another brother. This was Hattusa, heart of the Hittite Empire. For generations, its rulers had commanded much of Anatolia and northern Syria. They had fought Egypt, taken cities, negotiated marriages, and turned war into diplomacy. Their scribes wrote in several languages. Their armies crossed mountains. Their kings claimed the favor of 1,000 gods. Yet an empire can appear strongest at the moment when it has become most fragile. Near the end of the 13th century BCE, a man named Suppiluliuma II inherited the throne. He was the last known great king of Hittite. His official inscriptions spoke in the language expected of kings: victory, authority, divine protection. One text celebrated campaigns against enemies at sea. Another recorded conquests in southwestern Anatolia. Nothing in those royal words admitted that the ground beneath the empire was beginning to move. There is no surviving chronicle that tells us what Suppiluliuma thought when he walked through his capital. We do not know whether he believed the crisis would pass. We do not know whether he recognized that he would become the final ruler in a line that had endured for centuries. What survives is more unsettling. Orders for grain. Appeals for help. Reports of ships. Signs that cities once tied together by tribute, diplomacy, trade, and fear were beginning to face disaster alone. The end of the Hittite Empire was not a single night of flames. It was a narrowing corridor. Each season closed another door. Each failure made the next failure more dangerous. By the time Hattusa burned, the empire may already have vanished everywhere that mattered. To understand how this happened, we have to return to the city before the silence. Hattusa stood in central Anatolia, surrounded by rugged hills and severe winters. It was not placed beside a great river like Thebes or Babylon. It did not sit on a coast where grain ships could unload at the palace gate. Its power depended on organization. Food had to be grown, collected, stored, and moved. Soldiers had to be summoned from distant lands. Messages had to travel across roads where snow, mud, bandits, or rebellion could delay them. The court had to persuade local rulers that obedience was safer than independence. When the system worked, Hattusa was magnificent. Processions moved through gates and temple courtyards. Priests carried offerings. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into wet clay. Foreign envoys climbed toward the palace. Bronze weapons flashed in workshops. The smell of smoke, animals, bread, and damp earth mixed in the narrow spaces between buildings. The empire was not one people speaking one language. It was a political structure laid across many communities. Hittite kings ruled through treaties, vassals, governors, family alliances, military obligation, and ritual. Their world stretched from the Anatolian plateau toward the Syrian cities of the eastern Mediterranean. That world had survived danger before. Hattusa itself had been abandoned and restored in earlier centuries. Kings had faced rebellions, epidemics, assassinations, and invasion. The Hittite court had learned to recover. Its rituals even included detailed procedures for correcting mistakes made during ceremonies, as if order could always be restored when the proper words were spoken. But resilience has a hidden cost. Every recovery depends on reserves. Extra grain. Loyal soldiers. Functioning roads. Trusted officials. Cooperative allies. Time. Near 1200 BCE, those reserves were being tested together. The eastern Mediterranean was connected by movement. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin traveled across longer and less certain routes. Grain crossed seas. Luxury goods moved between palaces. Royal letters carried requests, threats, gifts, and promises. A disturbance in one region could be absorbed. Several disturbances at once could spread through the entire system. Across this world, old powers were entering a period of violence and contraction. Mycenaean palace centers in Greece were destroyed or abandoned. Ugarit on the Syrian coast disappeared in fire. Egypt fought attackers arriving by land and sea. Cities that had exchanged gifts for generations began sending warnings. The Hittites were not merely watching this crisis. They were inside it. At the center of their vulnerability was food. Central Anatolia could produce grain, but harvests were uncertain. The state maintained storage and redistribution systems partly because survival required planning. When local production failed, the empire could draw supplies from other regions. Its Syrian territories and maritime connections were therefore not distant ornaments. They were part of the machinery that kept the capital alive. Letters from the wider Hittite world reveal anxiety about grain and transport. Some refer to urgent shipments. Others show officials extracting resources from dependent territories. These texts do not give us a complete account, and they do not prove that every part of the empire was starving. But they show a system under pressure. Then the climate turned against it. Modern triering and isotope research has identified an unusually severe continuous dry period in central Anatolia around 1198 to 1196 BCE, allowing for a small margin of dating uncertainty. 3 years may sound brief beside the lifespan of an empire. For a state living from one harvest to the next, 3 failed or severely reduced seasons could be devastating. The first dry year could be endured. The second would consume reserves. The third could destroy confidence. Farmers might keep seed grain for their families rather than surrender it as tax. Herds would weaken as pasture failed. Prices would rise. Officials sent to collect food could meet resistance. Soldiers might desert to protect their own villages. The state would need more force at the exact moment when it had fewer resources to maintain force. Drought alone does not explain the end of Hatti. Climate cannot issue orders, burn palaces, or choose rebellion. Other societies survived dry periods. Parts of the former Hittite world continued after the imperial court disappeared. But drought could turn every existing weakness into an emergency. The empire's western territories had long been difficult to control. Local powers resisted Hittite authority. The north remained vulnerable to groups the texts called Akaska. In Syria, vassal cities balanced loyalty against survival. Trade routes could be interrupted by war or piracy. A king who needed grain from the coast also needed ships, crews, safe harbors, cooperative officials, and roads from port to inland storehouse. One broken link was trouble. Several broken links were collapse. Suppiluliuma too did not remain passive. His inscriptions present him as a warrior king. At least one text describes naval fighting connected with Alatia, usually identified with Cyprus. It is among the earliest known references to a sea battle. The king claimed victory. The triumph has a darker meaning when read against what followed. Why was the ruler of an inland empire fighting at sea? Perhaps control of maritime routes had become essential. Perhaps Cyprus mattered for copper, shipping, strategy, or rebellion. Perhaps the battle formed part of a wider conflict we can no longer reconstruct. The surviving inscription gives victory, not context. Royal monuments were designed to preserve success, not fear. Still, a pattern appears. The king was fighting on distant fronts while the center depended on resources moving through an unstable world. A victorious battle could not make rain fall. It could not refill an empty granary. It could not restore trust between a capital and provinces beginning to calculate their own chances of survival. This is where the story of collapse becomes difficult, because the evidence refuses to form one clean scene. For many years, the popular image was simple: invaders stormed Hattusa, set the city on fire, and erased the Hittite Empire. The ruins did contain burning. Parts of the capital were destroyed. In the wider eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian records described groups later gathered under the modern label, Sea Peoples. It was tempting to connect every ruin to one moving wave of attackers. But Hattusa does not behave like a city surprised at the height of life. Archaeological interpretation suggests that important parts of the capital may have been evacuated or stripped before the final destruction. Valuable objects were removed. Some official buildings appear to have been cleared. The royal family and central administration may have left before the fires consumed sections of the city. This changes everything. An enemy can destroy a capital. Only a government abandons one. Imagine the process, not as a dramatic escape, but as a series of decisions. A storeroom is emptied. A group of tablets is moved, while others remain. Metal fittings are removed from a doorway. Sacred objects are carried from a temple. Officials leave with carts. Families follow if they can. No proclamation announces that the empire is over. Each action can be described as temporary. A precaution. A relocation. A response to military danger. A measure until food arrives. The people making these decisions may have expected to return. History gives us no evidence that they did. The strongest mystery lies in what happened to the court. Suppiluliuma II disappears from the record. No later great king of Hutti is known at Hattusa. There is no surviving account of his death, no final tablet describing the evacuation, no inscription naming the enemy who ended his reign. The archive simply stops. That silence is more powerful than a battle narrative because it removes the comfort of a clear ending. We are left with fragments from the months and years before disappearance. Campaigns, administrative strain, shortages, and the weakening of connections. Some scholars have suggested that the royal court may have moved south, perhaps toward another center under Hittite control. Others emphasize internal conflict, external attack, or the gradual loss of imperial authority. The evidence does not allow certainty. What can be said is that the capital ceased to function as the center of a great kingdom. And once the center failed, the name of the empire no longer guaranteed obedience. In the north, enemies could move without fear of a major response. In the west, local rulers had no reason to wait for commands from an empty palace. In Syria, cities had to face their own crises. One of those cities was Ugarit. Ugarit was wealthy, literate, and connected to the sea. Its archives preserve the atmosphere of the final years with painful immediacy. Letters speak of danger, absent troops, and enemy ships. In one famous exchange, the ruler of Ugarit explains that his soldiers and chariots are away in Hittite territory while his ships are elsewhere. The city is exposed. Whether every letter belongs to the exact final sequence is debated, but the larger picture is clear. The network that once provided security was now pulling resources away from places that needed them. A vassal sent troops because the empire demanded them. Then the vassal was attacked without those troops. The structure built to protect the system had become a mechanism for spreading vulnerability. Ugarit burned and was never restored as the same city. Its destruction did not cause the fall of Hutti by itself. Yet it reveals the logic of the final crisis. Each center depended on others. Each center was under pressure. Aid promised from one place could not arrive because that place needed aid too. The empire had become a circle of unanswered requests. At Hattusa, the hills would have made the approaching winter feel close even in late summer. Nights cooled quickly. Dust settled on the stone roads. Water levels fell. The city's reservoirs and grain stores, once symbols of foresight, could only preserve what had been collected. The gods received prayers. Hittite political life did not separate religion from government. A failed ritual could be treated as a danger to the kingdom. An epidemic or military defeat could be understood as evidence of divine anger. Kings searched old records for forgotten offenses. Priests performed ceremonies to restore balance. In a time of drought, the pressure was not only physical. It was moral and cosmic. If the storm god withheld rain, someone had failed. If enemies crossed the border, someone had broken an oath. If a king could not feed the land, perhaps the gods no longer supported him. We should not invent the private thoughts of people who left no testimony. But we can recognize the burden created by their own political language. Hittite kings presented themselves as guardians of order between gods and humans. When order collapsed, the throne itself became part of the question. This may help explain why imperial breakdown could accelerate. Authority survives partly because people believe it will survive. A distant village delivers grain because officials will return next year. A vassal sends soldiers because the great king can punish refusal. A merchant risks a road because powerful states keep it open. Once that belief weakens, rational choices at the local level can destroy the larger system. A farmer hides grain. A governor keeps troops at home. A port delays a shipment. A vassal stops answering. None of these acts needs to overthrow the empire. Together, they make the empire impossible. By the time fire reached the buildings of Hattusa, the decisive destruction may already have occurred in human expectations. The palace could still stand. The title of great king could still be written. Orders could still be sealed. But fewer people believed that the order would be enforced. Then came the burning. Not every part of Hattusa was destroyed at the same moment. The archaeological layers are complex, and later activity complicates the picture. We cannot reconstruct one final night with confidence. There may have been attacks, deliberate destruction, accidental fires, or burning after abandonment. The image of a single enemy army flooding through the Lion Gate is dramatic. It is also more certain than the evidence permits. The last inhabitants may have watched smoke rise from a city already hollowed out. Attackers may have entered buildings whose treasures had been removed. Groups from the surrounding region may have scavenged what the court left behind. Fire may have completed a collapse that administration, hunger, and fear had begun. The walls survived because stone is patient. The empire did not, because empire exists only while people continue its relationships. Around the same period, Egypt recorded battles against groups arriving from the sea and across land. Pharaoh Ramesses III celebrated victory in temple reliefs and inscriptions. These records are important, but they are also royal propaganda. They present Egypt as a fortress holding back chaos. The people described there were not necessarily one nation or one army. They may have included migrants, raiders, displaced families, mercenaries, and defeated groups moving through a collapsing world. The phrase, "sea peoples," is modern. It can hide as much as it explains. Some of those movements may have struck Hittite territories. They cannot alone explain why the imperial center could not recover. The more revealing question is not who delivered the final blow. It is why the structure could no longer absorb one. For centuries, Hittite rulers had survived enemies. They had rebuilt cities, replaced kings, and restored alliances. Near 1200 BCE, military pressure arrived alongside drought, food insecurity, contested borders, unstable trade, and political fragmentation. The crisis was not one spear. It was a net tightening from every direction. This is the major turning point in the story. The empire did not lose because its enemies suddenly became stronger than its walls. It lost because every defense depended on another defense that was also failing. The army needed grain. The grain needed rain or imports. Imports needed ships and secure ports. Ports needed soldiers. Soldiers needed payment and loyalty. Loyalty needed confidence in the king. The king needed victories that could still change reality. Suppalulima could win a battle and lose the system. Once we see the empire this way, the disappearance of Hattusa becomes less mysterious and more disturbing. Complex societies rarely depend on one pillar. They depend on many supports arranged so that each carries the others. That arrangement creates strength. It also creates the possibility of cascading failure. A drought in central Anatolia increased dependence on coastal grain. Conflict at sea made coastal supply uncertain. Military demands weakened vassal cities. The destruction of those cities removed future supplies. Shortage weakened the authority needed to organize recovery. Weak authority encouraged defection. Defection created more military pressure. Each solution deepened another problem. There was no single moment when the king could simply reverse the chain. By the darkest stage, even success could become dangerous. A campaign might defeat an enemy but consume food. A grain levy might feed the capital but provoke rebellion. A demand for troops might defend the frontier but expose a vassal. A retreat might save the court but announce that the center could no longer protect itself. Every path led through loss. And yet the people living through this did not know they were inside a period later called the Bronze Age collapse. They knew only the next order. The next ration. The next rumor. A messenger from the coast. A village that had not delivered grain. A road no longer safe after sunset. A temple ceremony performed because the last one had failed. The great scale of history is visible only afterward. For those inside it, collapse arrives as ordinary decisions made under shrinking choices. Perhaps this is why the final Hittite years feel so close to us. Not because their world resembled ours in every way. It did not. But because they faced a familiar illusion. The belief that a system which survived yesterday must survive tomorrow. The Hittite state had archives full of precedent. There were rituals for plague, treaties for rebellion, military traditions for invasion, and administrative tools for shortage. Every individual problem had been encountered before. What had not been mastered was simultaneity. Too many problems arrived together. When the court left Hattusa, if it did leave in an organized withdrawal, it may have carried royal symbols and plans for continuity. The great king might have believed the capital was being sacrificed to preserve the dynasty. Officials may have expected to govern from another city. But an empire cannot be folded and carried like a tent. Its power lives in repeated acts of recognition. A seal accepted. A tax delivered. A border defended. A god honored in the king's name. Once those acts stop across a wide territory, moving the court cannot move the empire. After the fall, Hittite culture did not disappear. This matters. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, smaller states continued traditions connected to the Hittite world. Modern scholars often call them Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite kingdoms. Their rulers used Loian hieroglyphs, preserved royal symbols, and built monuments that carried elements of the old political culture into the Iron Age. Carchemish remained especially important. So the end of the empire was not the extinction of a people. It was the collapse of a particular system centered on Hattusa and ruled by a great king. This distinction protects the story from a false image of total darkness. Farmers remained. Families adapted. Local rulers claimed new authority. Crafts continued. Languages survived and changed. The empire vanished, but life moved through its ruins. Even Hattusa was not erased forever. People returned to parts of the site in later periods. The capital's stones remained visible under soil and weather. Centuries passed. The name of the Hittites faded from living political memory, though echoes survived in texts and neighboring traditions. Then the archives spoke again. Modern excavations uncovered thousands of clay tablets. A civilization once known only dimly became legible in its own records. Treaties revealed diplomacy. Laws revealed social order. Prayers revealed anxiety. Ritual texts revealed an intense effort to maintain harmony with the divine. The tablets also sharpened the silence at the end. A written state leaves expectations in the reader. We expect a final report. A last king list. A record of defeat. Someone to explain what happened. Hattusa gives us administration until administration fails. Then nothing. The last great king remains standing in his own inscriptions, forever victorious because no later inscription survived to contradict him. Suppiluliuma-II's fate is unknown. He may have died in battle, escaped with the court, been overthrown, or ruled briefly from somewhere else. Any confident final scene would be invention. But we can place him inside the choices his world imposed. He inherited a powerful title. He commanded an empire with shrinking resources. He fought enemies whose identities remain uncertain. He faced a climate shock that modern science can detect in trees more than 3,000 years later. And sometime near the opening of the 12th century BCE, his voice disappeared. The climax of the Hittite story is therefore not the burning of a gate. It is the moment the center stops being answered. A final order leaves Hattusa. Perhaps it requests grain. Perhaps troops. Perhaps loyalty. Somewhere beyond the hills, the recipient reads the seal and decides that the great king can no longer reward obedience or punish refusal. The message is set aside. No army marches. No shipment leaves. No answer returns. At that moment, whether or not the palace still stands, the empire is finished. The ruins invite us to search for an enemy because enemies make endings easy to understand. They give collapse a face. They divide the story into the world before the attack and the world after it. The Hittites offer a harder lesson. Their empire appears to have fallen through convergence. Environmental stress, war, internal weakness, disrupted exchange, and political fragmentation reinforced one another. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor. The severe drought identified around 1198 to 1196 BCE is powerful evidence, but it is not a complete verdict. Burning at Hattusa is real, but it does not tell us who lit every fire or when every district was abandoned. Texts about enemy ships reveal danger, but not a single force responsible for every destruction. The honest answer is not that we know nothing. It is that the collapse had many authors. Some were human. Some were environmental. Some were decisions that made sense for one village, one city, or one season while destroying the larger structure. And some were consequences no one intended. Today, the Lion Gate still opens onto the Anatolian hills. Its stone animals have watched empires, kingdoms, travelers, archaeologists, and tourists pass between them. Beyond the gate, foundations trace rooms where people once believed their world was permanent. Wind moves through the grass. The temples are roofless. The archives have been carried to museums. The roads end among stones. Yet Hattusa does not feel like a place defeated in one instant. It feels like a place from which certainty slowly withdrew. That may be the true reason its story endures. The Hittites were not weak. They were organized, experienced, literate, militarized, and connected. They did not fall because they lacked every defense. They fell because their defenses depended on a world that was breaking at the same time. The capital burned only after the invisible empire. Its trust, supply, obedience, and expectation had already begun to disappear. And when the last smoke cleared above Hattusa, there was no one left with enough power to call the system back. The stones remained. The title vanished. The silence became the final monument of the great kings. If stories like this stay with you, another forgotten world is waiting just beyond these ruins. Until next time, thank you for listening. Subscribe to Silent Empires and turn on notifications.